In this episode of NuBuilds, we're going to take a look at a surprisingly effective build that revolves around the balance of power. All that being said, if you want to see more NuBuilds content, Destiny 2 content, and of course much more down the road, then be sure as always to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get into the video. At first glance, I initially thought that Balance of Power was an exotic that focused primarily around PvP, most notably in its double down perk section where it states that while you're near your Spectre, you do not appear on radar. However, what really caught my attention was the first portion, which states that your Spectre has increased duration and durability, and damaging it releases additional threadlings. This is really where I felt Balance of Power could shine potentially in PvE, and I was quite surprised by its potency. And that's just because having all these Spectres on the field, producing all the additional threadlings, but most importantly, lasting on the field for longer periods of time, really allowed for me to reposition and apply pressure when needed, and so it gave me a lot of defensive control. So the overall blueprint for this build comes down to team chemistry, or at least team-wide gameplay, but more importantly, defensive control. So in this build, we're going to be focusing on the Prismatic Hunter for Void, most notably the Shadow Shot Deadfall, and that's because we want to be weakening and suppressing targets, thus allowing us to gain more value on the battlefield pertaining to the Spectres, but also dealing damage to bosses, because once we weaken them, we can do more damage long term. So we're going to go into the aspects and fragments much later into the video, so stay tuned for that. But for now, the overall blueprint is that we want to make use of our Strand and Void weapons to therefore get the advantage and give us enough opportunity to apply consistent pressure offensively, but also giving us a chance to survive defensively too. So let's move on to the next section. In this section, I would say that this is perhaps the most flexible of the build, since weapons really come down to the player and what really works for you. However, I will say that it's best to try and optimize your Strand and Void weapons, since you want to be playing into this build as much as you possibly can. So build-wise, or at least weapon-wise, I tend to go with things like Final Warning, the Call. The Call is really great because you have things like Slice activated, and once that's applied, you're taking less damage from the enemy, and because you can apply to multiple targets, it can really be effective. Final Warning, of course, as we already know, is extremely potent right now. Sidearms receive the buff, and thus Final Warning can really do massive damage. And if you have the Catalyst does so much more. It's so much more potent, so I highly recommend using this if you are going to go with this build. However, again, like I said, this is very flexible, so it's really up to you. You can use something like the Buried Bloodline if you have it, which is incredible with this build. But also things like Graviton Lance. Graviton Lance is amazing because this season, Pulse Rifle receives a massive buff, and thus the Graviton Lance really has a great pairing. And also, I think what's more notable here is that Graviton Lance drops those Void Orbs every respective kill, which pairs well into your Spectres, which can proc and explode, and thus now you have Void Orbs and Threadlings just causing, you know, a greater degree of ad clearing potential, which goes more into the team player type of approach with this build. This isn't necessarily a huge damage output build. This is more of a let's survive, let's help our team to survive, and thus the whole team wins type of build. As far as your heavy slot, this once again is very flexible. I go with something with Stasis just because I typically want to just slow things down, and it pairs well into the Winter Shroud aspect, which I'll get into very soon. Just help me to apply more pressure, and then come boss phase, more precision is always nice, but I also love Microcosm. Microcosm is such a fantastic heavy weapon right now, and most notably because of this build, Deadfall is a one-shot and move on type of super, and so Microcosm, with regards to its trait, it states that final blows with this weapon grants super energy, which works well into our build too. This weapon gains bonus damage once your super expires. So because we're just instantly popping our super, tethering targets, weakening them, suppressing them. We can quick swap over to Microcosm in a damage phase and do some pretty sizable damage. So overall, again, the weapon selection here is really all about what you love, but just try and focus on Strand and Void since you want to play into the whole entire build and get the most value. So that being said, let's move on to the next point. Here we are at the final section, the final piece of the puzzle. And we're going to kick things off with the super and then move into our respective categories from aspects and fragments, then finishing things off with the armor mods and a peek at the journal. So Deadfall plays a really integral role here since we really want to be able to weaken targets and suppress them, thus giving us a chance to apply offensive pressure, but also being able to survive for longer periods of time defensively. It's great because it plays into the whole balance, right? Balance of power. And I think that Deadfall is a really well-rounded super that gives you both that offensive and defensive approach. This ties well into the likes of Combination Blow and Grapple, since these are also both offensive but also defensive in the way that you utilize them. Most notably with the Grapple, Grapple gives you a chance to push into your target, do some melee damage, or if you're under too much pressure, you can grapple back out and reposition. Combination Blow just allows for you to get in close, punch, replenish your health, and just re-engage and just reapply that pressure to ensure that you stay alive. Then it works in tandem with our aspects, which of course will be Spectre and the Winter Shroud. Spectre is great because now we're utilizing the Balance of Powers perk, giving us a longer duration of time with our Spectres as well as their durability and the additional threadlings that we get. This adds more potency and just long-term survival on the battlefield. Winter Shroud is just a nice combination since it helps to slow enemies down, thus giving me a chance to punch them with more efficiency. And it's just great overall since it does build into replenishing your class ability generation. And fragments. Fragments, we have the most important facet here, and that is your faster protection. And this is because when you do engage with the enemy, you want to be able to resist that incoming damage. So this plays well into Combination Blow as well as your grapple when you are in close. Next, you have your Facet of Ruin, which plays into our Winter Shroud, since every time we do punch and explode as far as enemies, this Facet of Ruin kicks in, thus giving us more AoE burst potential. Next, we have Facet of Devotion, which is also great since we are playing with a lot of Stasis and Strand, most notably Strand, since we have a lot of it in our build. But this gives us that bonus light transcendence. And so it also pairs well since we also already have the likes of Void being light and we have Arc being light. So we have, again, a nice balance of power with regards to our light and dark energies. Facet of Courage is fantastic here too, since now our Void abilities, our Arc and Solar will get more damage when we afflict them with Darkness debuffs. So since we're always going to be applying Darkness debuffs with regards to our Shroud and our Deaded Spectre, and even the likes of Grapple, we're going to be making use of the Courage really, really well. Next, we have the Facet of Purpose, and this one is also integral since you want to be able to pick up your orbs, which we'll be making a lot of, and this will give you a nice proper overshield to help you sustain when you do happen to go for a more aggressive approach. And then lastly, we have Facet of Bravery, which I think is awesome here too, since you are going to be making use of your Void and Strand weapons. And so therefore, defeating targets with grenade final blows will give you volatile rounds to your Void weapons, and defeating targets with powered melee final blows grants unraveling rounds to your Strand weapons. So this is just a nice pairing and giving your Void and Strand weapons even more potency, especially when it comes to dealing with adds and just even bosses too. So that in itself is, once again, the balance of power in this build. So we're going to take a look now at the armor mods. So armor mods, we have Dynamo and we have Hands-On. Dynamo I've chosen just because I want to be able to reduce that super cooldown, thus giving me more time to use my Deadfall, because that's going to be our main go-to to just, you know, sink more damage into the enemy, slowing things down, weakening them, and thus giving us more momentum. Then hands-on, since we're always going to be meleeing things, this gives us more energy as well for a super. You can always swap out Dynamo if you need to, and perhaps utilize things like Ashes to Assets if you want to. I just chose Dynamo because it just felt more in line with what I wanted to do. Next up, we have the gauntlets, and we have firepower and heavy-handed. Both are great pairing since you're going to be utilizing both your grenade and melee most often anyway. So this is also nice. Chest piece, we've gone with the usual concussive dampener and melee damage since we're going to be, once again, drawing a lot of our attention up close a lot of the time. But also, even if we're not, concussive dampener is still great for that AoE damage resistance. Next, balance of power. On its boots, we have Strand Weapon Surge as well as Void Weapon Surge for the obvious reasons. We want to be doing more damage over time and thus giving us more of that ability to stay alive, and in damage phases, we can at least be of great service to our team and ourselves when need be. Then I just threw in the recuperation. This can also be swapped out for whatever you want, whatever you desire. I just like being able to replenish my health every time I have an overpower. So in the event that, let's say, I don't optimize or I'm not able to utilize my combination blow for whatever reason, just having an orb on the floor can always be nice to recuperate. And then lastly, we have our cloak, and our cloak has Reaper, Outreach, and Bomber, all of which play into the melee slash grenade abilities, and then Reaper just being able to utilize more orbs of power over time. And I've only made some slight adjustments to the Hunter's Journal, most notably in the Expanding Abyss and the Void Hegemony. So Expanding Abyss is fantastic here since we're going to be utilizing a lot of Void. So being able to deal increased damage to weakened targets, this is going to be really effective since we're going to be using Deadfall to hit, let's say, a boss during a damage phase, weaken that boss, and thus now our Void weapons like Graviton Lance or Buried Bloodline can now be of greater use. So those are the only things I really made adjustments to. I also did add in the Pulse Rifle for anti-barrier. This, of course, is preference for you. You know, whatever you want to use here, it really is your choice. But I've gone with this because Pulse Rifles are really good this season, so by all means. And then because I use a lot of sidearms, Final Warning, the Call, Unstoppable Sidearm is going to be the obvious pick here. But everything else, it really comes down to you. Also, yes, Thundered Blast. Make sure you have this as well, because you're going to be using a lot of strands, so getting that additional AoE explosion will be also really, really valuable. And that's about it. So hopefully this has given you a closer look at the Balance of Power PVE build and why it's effective. And hopefully it can be just as effective for you when you utilize it. Now, of course, this is all going to vary from player to player. Whoever pilots this build, it really all depends on who the pilot is. So I just want to preface this by saying not every build will work for you. Some builds will work better than others, but I hope that this build will help you in your journey to become the best Guardian. All that being said, New Warriors, thank you for tuning in. As always, stay strong, keep fighting, and may the Force be with you all, always. See you in the next episode of NuBuilds. Take care, and peace out.